I'm Jordan Hansen. I'm a professional VFX artist that's worked on some of the most popular shows on television. Last time I introduced the channel, my wife said I came off as a little low energy, so let's try this again. This is Mighty North. This is part 2 of my screen insert series. This time I'll walk you through what to do with oddly shaped screens and how to deal with elements that pass in front of the screen. If you want to follow along, you can download the footage and the project file from my website. The link is below. Now enough preamble, let's dive in. I'm going to speed through anything I covered in the first screen inserts video, so if anything isn't clear, check back there. In After Effects, I've set up the project already. I'll be working in 16 bits again, and I've sorted the footage and the screen element into the appropriate folders. I've also created a comp and labeled the layers in the comp because it's a good habit to label your work. Now let's take a look at what we're going to be working with. It's not often that you'll get footage to work on that has a screen similar in brightness and color to the element you're inserting, but if you're on set or working on your own project, it will really help to sell the effect. Lastly, I've set up the temp color to make sure that what we do will hold up as the shot goes to the colorist. The first thing to do with this comp is tracking the screen. I'll be doing this with Mocha again, and it will be mostly the same as in part 1, with a few minor differences here and there that I'll call out as we go. This time, instead of tracking the entire screen, I'm going to just track the frame around the screen. It becomes more important if there is anything moving on screen, or if there are heavy reflections that throw off the track. So I grab the X-spline tool and draw a selection around the frame of the screen. Then I'll turn on the surface and align the edges to the edges of the screen. I've set up a mat that I'll use later to round the corners and knock out the screen notch. Then I'll start tracking the footage the same way I did in part 1. Take your time. Adjust your selection as you need to. It's probably going to slip on some of the motion blur. For the last few frames, I'm going to switch the tracking style to just translation. That way, Mocha won't distort the screen as it moves out of frame because it doesn't have enough image to solve the track. And this last bit, I'll just hand track in the next step. Then I track the back half of the shot the same way, making sure to switch back to translation, scale, rotation, and shear for the style of track. I'll switch to a translation-only track again for the last couple frames, and adjust the spline where it slips off from the motion blur. Then I'll jump into the Adjust Track module to clean up the track and handle the frames as the phone leaves and enters the frame. I'll start adjusting my track from a frame before it starts to slip at all. Frame 15 looks good. Switching to the Adjust Track module now will set a keyframe on the corner points of our surface. From there, I adjust it by hand until the phone is off screen. I can't see this point anymore, but I'll follow this left edge of the screen to help adjust it. These last couple frames are just kind of a guess. I don't really have much to reference, so I'll just try to keep the screen the same size as it leaves frame. Most of the detail will be lost in the motion blur, so it's okay if it's not perfect. I'll continue the hand track one more frame once it's off screen, so there'll be motion blur on the first frame that it's on screen. This shot's catching a moment in time that's part of a larger motion, so we need to account for that in the motion blur. If you're finding the screen too cluttered, you can click this button to turn off the tangent handles. That makes it a little easier to focus on the surface rather than the spline. Then I just repeat the process on the back half of the shot. We want to try and be as accurate as possible. We'll be using a graphic element, so it'll be really easy to tell when the screen is slipping. You can add a keyframe with this button down here, so I'll do that to start off for the back end adjustments. Since we don't have a landmark, I'll line up this green line with the blue edge to help guide the adjustment. I'll pull these points down to ensure I have motion blur while the phone exits frame entirely. Lastly, double-click Layer 1 and name it Tracking Data so we know what we're getting in After Effects. Save and close, and we'll head back into After Effects. Now back in After Effects, I'll create a placeholder solid for the screen. Mocha expects the track to be applied to an element the same size as the footage. I'm going to be using an element that is a different size and aspect ratio, so to get the track to scale correctly, I'll apply it first to the placeholder solid. Once the tracking data is applied to the placeholder solid, and if you're getting lost through any of this, check back in part 1. I cover all this in detail. I'll pre-compose the solid by going to Layer, Pre-compose, and select to leave all attributes in this comp. This way, I'll be able to match the scaling on the element to the size of the placeholder solid. I'll then double-click the screen pre-comp to jump inside. Now is one of the main differences from part 1. I'll drag the screen element into the timeline. This is just an element I made in Photoshop to match iPhone screen specs. Now turn off the solid. It's done its job. Now select the element, then go to Layer, Transform, Fit to Comp. Now it looks really distorted, but if I go back into the main comp, it fits normally. This is why I created the solid placeholder. Since Mocha is expecting the element the same size as the footage, I'll need to distort the element to match the footage, then undistort it in the main comp. Also, working this way allows me to work on a normal looking element, then resize it to match whatever final delivery spec I need. I also made a matte for the iPhone screen to round the corners and cut out the notch. I'll do just the same thing to set that up. I'll drag it to the top of the screen comp and then go Layer, Transform, Fit to Comp. Then I'll select the track matte of the screen element and change it to Alpha Inverted Matte. Now, looking at the main comp, we can see the screen fits into the phone. At this point, I'll set up the screen element animation. You can take a look at what I've done in the project file, but it's all pretty simple keyframe animation. I'll also include the layered Photoshop file in the project download so you can change it however you want. Now I'll watch it through a couple times to make sure that nothing looks like it's drifting or slipping on screen, especially around the corners. The next step is to get the thumb and pinky back in front of the screen. In this case, it could probably be pulled off with a key, but more often than not, this will be best done by rotoscoping the footage. So I'll show you the roto method today, and I'll go over keying in another lesson. Click the tracking comp, open up the effects controls, and let's launch back into Mocha. Click this gear to turn off the tracking for the screen track layer. Then click the eyeball to hide the layer. I also like to change my tracking layers to this green. Any color is fine really, but it helps me stay organized. And last, I'll lock it so I don't accidentally select the layer. Now, I'll focus on the thumb. I'll get nice and close, and then I'll grab the X-spline tool, and starting a little outside the edge of the element, I'll trace around the thumb, being pretty accurate as I go. Then right-click to finalize the spline. I'm not worried about the surface anymore, so I'll click this button here to turn it off. Then I'll adjust the tangent weights and make any tweaks I need to the spline so it's sitting right on the edge of the thumb. And once the spline is nice and tight to the edge of the thumb, I'll just start tracking the footage. I'll start tracking backward a handful of frames at a time, and I'll stop to make any adjustments I need to the spline. I'll continue this way until the motion blur really kicks in. Once the shape starts to become distorted by the motion blur, the process doesn't really change. It just requires more adjustment by hand. Try to keep the spline stuck to the edges of the thumb where no screen is showing through. That way, when you apply motion blur in the comp, the original footage is less likely to show through. Keep the spline stuck to the thumb even as it distorts. It may look strange the frame it's on, but it'll look right in motion. Towards the end, you'll start to see error messages like this. They're saying there aren't enough similar pixels to track, so for the last couple of frames, I'll just have to adjust the spline by hand. Be sure to also continue to animate the thumb one frame after it goes off screen, so the motion blur will continue all the way through instead of starting or ending with a sharp frame. Once the front half of the shot looks good, I'll do the same for the back half. Then I'll check the whole shot to make sure the spline is sticking. Then I'll name this layer Thumb, turn off tracking, and save and close Mocha. Now back in After Effects, I'll go Layer, New, Solid, and make sure it's comp size, then hit OK. In the timeline window, I'll drag the new layer above the screen, and I'll name it Foreground_Matte. Now I'll make sure the playhead is at the first frame of the comp, select the tracking comp, minimize the tracking section, and expand the matte section. Then I'll select All Visible from the Shape drop-down and then click Create AE Masks. This will create a mask on the tracking layer, so expand the tracking comp controls, then expand the mask section, then select the thumb mask and go Edit, Cut. Then select the foreground matte solid in the timeline and hit Edit, Paste. Now if I jump to the middle of the shot, you can see a black solid sitting just on top of the thumb. And if I expand the mask controls on the foreground matte, I can adjust the mask feather to something like 3 pixels. Then I'll select the plate layer and go Edit, Duplicate, and drag the duplicate just below the foreground matte layer. Then I'll click the Track Matte drop down and change it to Alpha Matte. And now the thumb is on top of this screen, and I'll rename the duplicate layer to Foreground Footage. Then I'll repeat the whole process for the pinky. Then I'll rename this layer Pinky and turn off its tracking. Then I'll hide the thumb layer and lock it, then save and close Mocha. Do just the same thing to create a mask from the pinky layer in After Effects. And since I have All Visible selected from the Shapes drop-down menu and turned off the thumb layer in Mocha, it will just create a pinky mask. Then select the mask on the tracking layer and hit Edit, Cut. Then be sure you're on the first frame of the comp. Select the tracking matte layer and hit Edit, Paste. Now you can see the pinky's in front of the screen, but it's a lot sharper than it should be. So I'll expand the mask controls and adjust the mask feather and mask expansion until it looks about right. Something like 30 pixels for the feather and 10 pixels for the expansion looks pretty good. Now I'll solo the foreground footage layer to see if I'm pulling too much of the original screen footage in. And that looks pretty good. If I look ahead a bit, I can see there's no motion blur on the thumb or pinky. So I'll toggle modes and switches and turn on the motion blur for the foreground matte layer. Now I'll preview the comp to see how the track and the roto look together. The track and the roto look good, so I'll pick a frame and start integrating the screen into the footage. I'll follow just the same steps as in part 1. I'll start by matching the color spaces. Next, I'll soften the footage and create a fake depth map using a ramp to match the focus, and then I'll create a bloom and glow by duplicating and blurring the element, and last I'll match the grain on the element to the grain on the footage. Since this will all be the same as part 1, I'll speed through this whole section, and you can check the project for the specific values I landed on, and check back in part 1 if you're feeling lost in this section. I go over this whole process in detail. And we've come a pretty long way on this shot. Let's look at the original plate to remind you what we started with. Then let's look at the tracked comp. And finally, the fully integrated finished comp. Let me know what you thought of this video, and I'll be back with more production-ready VFX. See you next time!